Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy-Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy-Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy-Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools that I use, and justify my time thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you find Sleepy-Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you would like to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, and you have the means, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can also get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look at what's on offer, and sign up if you're willing, and again, if you have the means. If monthly seems like a big ask though, and I completely understand if this is the case, you can make once-off tips through the tip jar on the website. And if you'd like to find a way to help out Sleepy-Time Tales without having to do it financially, the best thing you can do to help out is simply spread the word. If you know someone in person who's struggling to sleep, or you know someone on social media, just tell them about Sleepy-Time Tales and maybe it will help them. That's all it takes. And that's enough of that. Let's go on with the relaxing stuff. Elizabeth Montagu, the Queen of the Bluestockings. Her correspondences from 1720 to 1761, by her great-great-niece, Emily J. Clemenson. Preface. From my early youth, I heartily desired to know more of the life of my great-great-aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Montagu. Every scrap of information I could pick up respecting her I accumulated. Therefore, when my cousins, Mrs. Wellesley and her sister, Miss Montagu, in October 1899, gave me the whole of her manuscripts contained in 68 cases, holding from 100 to 150 letters in each, my joy was unbounded. In 1810, my grandfather, the 4th Baron Rokeby, her nephew and adopted son, published 2 volumes of her letters. These were followed by 2 more volumes in 1813. To enable him to perform this pleasing task, he asked all her principal friends to return her letters to him, beginning with the Dowager Marchioness of Bath, daughter of the Duchess of Portland, who gave him back the earliest letters to her mother, many carefully inserted in a curious grey paper book by the Duchess, who placed the date of reception on each, and evidently valued them exceedingly. The Reverend Montagu Pennington returned her letters to his aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, the learned translator of Epictetus, Mrs. Friend, those to her husband, and many other people did the same. From General Pulteney, at Lord Bath's death, she had asked for and received her correspondence with Lord Bath, which he carefully preserved. At the death of Lord Littleton, the executors, at her request, returned her letters. Those to Gilbert West and other correspondents were returned in the same manner. Meanwhile, she kept all letters of her special friends, as well as notabilities, so that one may deem the collection quite unique. Though doubtless many letters have disappeared, notably those of Sir Joshua Reynolds, many of whose letters were destroyed by an ignorant caretaker of Mrs. Montagu's house, Denton Hall, near Newcastle on Tyne. Though none of Horace Walpole's, from whom she must have received some, and those from several other celebrities she knew well are missing. Owing to the enormous quantity of letters undated, the sorting has been terribly difficult, and I spent one entire winter in making up bundles and labeling each year. Our grandfather made a variety of mistakes as to the dates of the letters. I hope I have atoned for some of his deficiencies, though a few mistakes are probably inevitable. He nearly blinded himself by working at night, and my grandmother had constantly to copy the letters in a large round hand to enable him to make them out. After my grandmother's death, he discontinued arranging them, though they might have been continued until 1800, the year of Mrs. Montagu's death. In the present volume, only her early life is presented, interwoven with portions of her most intimate letters friends to herself. Were the whole of this vast correspondence printed, a large bookcase would be filled with the volumes. In order to consult the varied tastes of the general reader, I have endeavored to pick out the most interesting portions of her letters, such as relate to customs, fashions in dress, price of food, habits. But I have often groaned in spirit at having to leave out much that was noble in sentiment, or long comments upon contemporary books and events. If life should be spared me, I hope to be able to continue my narrative, for like the ring produced by a stone thrown on the water, her circle of friends and acquaintances increased yearly, and not only comprised her English friends and every person of distinction in Great Britain, but also the most distinguished foreigners of all nations, notably the French. It has been asserted that Gilbert West was the first person to influence Mrs. Montagu on religious points. That his amiable Christianity may have strengthened her religious opinions, I do not deny. But I hope it will be seen from this book that from her earliest days, when at the height of her joie de vivre, the religious sentiment was existent, a religion that prompted her ever to the kindest actions to all classes, that had nothing bitter or narrow in it, no dogmatism. Adored by men of all opinions, and liking their society, she was the purest of the pure, as is amply proved by the letters of Lord Littleton, Dr. Monsey, and others. But she was no prude with all this. Her worthy husband adored her, and no wife could have been more devoted and obedient than she was. His was a noble character, and doubtless influenced her much for good. As a wife, a friend, a comrade in all things, grave or gay, she was unequalled. As a housewife she was notable, beloved by her servants, by the poor of her parish, and by her minors and their wives and children. She planned feasts and dances and instituted schools for them, and fed and clothed the destitute. With Mr. Raikes, she was one of the first people to institute Sunday schools. She was as interested in Betty's rheumatism as she was in the conversation of a duke or a duchess, a discussion with bishops and Gilbert West on religion, or with Emerson on mathematics, or Elizabeth Carter on Epictetus, all came alike to her gifted nature. She danced with the gay, she wept with the mourner. Her sympathies never lay idle, even to the very end of her life, and in a century which has been deemed by many to be coarse, uneducated, and irreligious, her sweet, wholesome nature shone like a star, and attracted all minor lights. Where in the 20th century should we find a coterie of men and women of the highest rank and influence in the world, either from intellect or position, so content and devoted to each other, so free from the petty jealousies and sarcasms of the present fashionable society, so anxious for each other's welfare, socially and morally, so free from cant or prudery, so devoted to each other's interests. A great and terrible break in this book was caused by the death of my beloved husband in May 1904, after a long lingering illness. I doubt if I should have taken courage to resume my pen if it had not been for my friend, Mr. A.M. Broadley, whose interest in my literary work and affectionate solicitude for myself has been a kindly spur to goad me on to action, so as to complete the present volumes. To him I tender my thanks for past and present encouragement, as well as many other kindnesses. Chapter 1. Girlhood up to 1738, and beginning of the correspondence with the Duchess of Portland. Before entering on the life of Elizabeth Robinson, afterwards Mrs. Edward Montagu, the famous Barbleau, the focus, as she may be called, of all the cleverest and most intellectual society of the last half of the 18th century, a few words must be said of the family she sprang from. The Robinsons are said to have been originally Robertsons, the name being corrupted into Robinson. They are in many peerages said to descend from the Robertsons of Struan, or Strowan, in Perthshire, who descended from Duncan de Aloysia, Earl of Atholl, hence descendants of Duncan, King of Scotland. My grandfather, the 4th Baron Rokeby, in an unfinished pedigree, believed this, but there have been Robinsons bearing the name, coat of arms in Yorkshire as early as the time of copyhold record in Edward III's reign. However, they may have been related. Our narrative starts from William, said to be the younger son of the 7th Baron Robertson of Strowan, who, being deprived of his portion of inheritance as younger son by the Earl of Atholl, fled into England and settled at Kendal in Westmoreland in the time of Henry VIII. He had 3 children, Ralph, Henry, and Ursula. Ralph married Agnes Philip, by whom he had William, who succeeded to his father's estates at Kendal and Brignall, and who on June 7, 1610, bought the estate of Rokeby in Yorkshire from Sir Thomas Rokeby, whose family had been possessed of it before the Conquest. Rokeby continued to belong to the Robinson family for 160 years, when long Sir Thomas Robinson sold it in 1769 to John B. Story Morritt, the friend of Sir Walter Scott. The Robinsons finally assumed 2 lines, William, the eldest, remaining master of Rokeby, and his posthumous brother, Leonard, becoming the direct ancestor of our heroine. Leonard Robinson was a merchant in London. He became Chamberlain of the City of London, and was knighted on October 26, 1692. He married first Lucy Leighton of West Leighton, etc., by whom he had no issue. For his second wife he married Deborah, daughter of Sir James Collett, Knight and Sheriff of London, by whom he had 6 daughters, all of whom married and had issue, and one son, Thomas, who married a widow, Elizabeth Light. She was daughter of William Clark, Esquire of Merivale Abbey, Warwickshire, and heiress of a brother, William Clark. By her first husband, Anthony Light, she had 1 daughter, Lydia. By her second, with Thomas Robinson, she had 3 sons. Matthew, the eldest alone, concerns us as father of Mrs. Montagu, We now enter the history of Matthew Robinson, the eldest surviving son of Thomas and his wife Elizabeth. He was born in 1694, therefore was only 6 years old when his father died. At an early age, he was entered at Trinity College, Cambridge, and became a fellow commoner. He was a person of great intellectual parts, a conversationalist and wit, the life of the coffee house, which then served as clubs do nowadays, as a rendezvous for men of fashion. His talent for painting was remarkable. His great-nephew states, he acquired so great a proficiency as to excel most of the professional artists of his day and landscape. At the early age of 18, in 1712, he married Elizabeth Drake, daughter of Councillor Robert Drake of Cambridge, descended from the Drakes of Ash in Devonshire. Elizabeth's mother's name was Sarah Morris. The Morris family had been seated in Kent, at East Horton, since the reign of Elizabeth. Thomas Morris, father of Sarah, built the mansion of Mount Morris, sometimes called Monk's Horton, near Hythe. He had one son, Thomas, who was drowned under London Bridge on his return from Holland in 1697 at 23. His sister Sarah had 2 children by Councillor Drake, Morris and Elizabeth. Their maternal grandfather lived to 1717 when he devised his estates to his grandson, Morris Drake, with the proviso of his assuming the extra name of Morris, and failing of his issue with remainder to Elizabeth, his sister, then Mrs. Matthew Robinson. Her mother, Mrs. Drake, having become a widow, had remarried the celebrated Dr. Conyers Middleton, but had no children by him. To return to the Robinsons, they settled at the property of West Leighton Hall, derived from Lucy Leighton, first wife of Sir Leonard Robinson, and Edgeley in Wensleydale for the summer, and spent the winter in York. Most country families at that period repairing to London or their nearest county town for convenience and society during the winter. To this young couple were born 12 children, of whom 7 sons and 2 daughters lived to grow up. Matthew, born April 6, 1713, afterwards 2nd Baron Rokeby, educated at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, became a fellow. Died November 30th, 1800 at 87. Thomas, born 1714, died 1746, barrister at law. Morris, born 1715, died 1777, of the 6 Clerk's Office. Elizabeth, born at York, October 2nd, 1720, died August 25th, 1800. Robert, Captain ERCS, died in China, 1756. Sarah, born September 21st, 1723, died 1795. William, born 1726, died 1803. John of Trinity Hall, Cambridge. Charles, born 1733, died 1807. Elizabeth, the subject of this book, was about 7 years old when, by the death of her uncle, Morris Drake Morris, her mother inherited, as his heir, the important property of East Horton and Mount Morris in Kent. The family then left Yorkshire for residence at Mount Morris. But before and after the inheritance of the Kentish property, much time was spent with the Conyers Middletons, both at Coveney, Cambridgeshire, a property Mrs. Conyers Middleton had inherited from her first husband, Councillor Drake, the advowson of the living being hers. She bestowed it on her second husband, Dr. Conyers Middleton, whom she had married in 1710, also at Cambridge, where was their usual residence, and where several of the little Robinsons were born in their grandmother's house, as we learn from a letter of Dr. Middleton's. Elizabeth Robinson was naturally much with her grandmother, with whom, and Conyers Middleton, she was a great favourite. Her nephew and adopted son, in his volumes of her letters that he published in 1810, states, "Her uncommon sensibility and acuteness of understanding, as well as extraordinary beauty as a child, rendered her an object of great notice in the university, and Dr. Middleton was in the habit of requiring from her an account of the learned conversations at which, in his society, she was frequently present, not admitting that the excuse of her tender age is a disqualification, but insisting that although at the present time she could but imperfectly understand their meaning, she would in future derive great benefit from the habit of attention inculcated by this practice." Her father was proud of her vivacious wit, and encouraged her gifts of repartee, which she possessed in as large a measure as himself. In her youth, her beauty was most admired in the peculiar animation and expression of her blue eyes, with high arched eyebrows, and in the contrast of her brilliant complexion with her dark brown hair. She was of the middle stature, and stooped a little, which gave an air of modesty to her countenance, in which the features were otherwise so strongly marked as to express an elevation of sentiment befitting the most exalted condition. Her elder brothers, members of Cambridge University, were all extremely literary, and became early distinguished scholars. We are told, their emulation produced a corresponding zeal in their sisters, and a diligence of application unusual in females of that time. Their domestic circle was accustomed to struggle for the mastery in wit, or in superiority in argument, and their mother, whose frame of mind partook rather of the gentle sedateness of good sense than of the eccentricities of genius, was denominated by them the speaker, from the frequent mediation by which she moderated their eagerness for victory. In Harris's History of Kent, published in 1719, on page 156, is a picture of Mount Morris, the home of the Robinsons. A large square house with a cupola surmounted by a ball and a weathercock, surrounded by a number of walled gardens laid out in the formal Dutch manner. An inner topiary garden leading to a steep flight of steps to the front door. Whilst staying in Cambridgeshire, Elizabeth had several times visited at Wimpole with her mother and father. Wimpole was the seat of Edward, 2nd Earl of Oxford and Mortimer, who had married Henrietta Cavendish, only daughter and heiress of John Holles, 1st Duke of Newcastle on Tyne. She was a great heiress and brought her husband £500,000. She is said to have been a good but very dull woman, very proud and a rigid worshipper of etiquette. In the national biography, she is said to have disliked most of the wits who surrounded her husband and hated Pope. The Earl spent enormous sums in collecting books, manuscripts, pictures, medals, and articles of virtue, spending £400,000 of his wife's fortune. To him we are indebted for the Harlequin manuscripts, bought from his widow in 1753 for £10,000 by the nation, now in the British Museum. With the Lady Margaret Cavendish Harley, only child of the Earl and Countess of Oxford, Elizabeth became on the most intimate terms, and her first extant letter is addressed to her when she was only 11 years old, and the Lady Margaret 18. So greatly did Lady Margaret value Elizabeth's letters that for a series of years she preserved them between the leaves of an old grey book which I possess. The first letter is endorsed, received February 24th, 1731, at Wimpole. It commences, "Madam, your ladyship's commands always give me a great deal of pleasure, but more especially when you ordered me to do myself this honour, without which I durst not have taken that liberty. For it would have been a great impertinence in me to have attempted it, and it is condescension in your ladyship to order it." This alludes evidently to Lady Margaret having desired her to write to her. It ends, "My duty to my Lord and Lady Oxford, and service to Lord Duplin, and my best respects to Miss Walton. Hope in a little while it may be duty. I'm in great hopes that when your ladyship sees any impertinent people in London, it will put you in mind of Madam. Your ladyship's most obliged, humble servant, Elizabeth Robinson." The formal terms in this letter were then considered essential, even when addressing those of the lower birth, all the more so to a person of Lady Margaret's rank. Viscount Duplin, whose name frequently occurs in the letters, was a cousin of Lady Margaret's on her father's side, her mother being a daughter of Robert Harley, 1st Earl of Oxford. The two young friends now kept up a lively correspondence, but as many of the letters have been published by my grandfather in 1810, I shall for this early period of her life give only a resume of them, picking out such facts as point to the manners of the time, or that strike one as of interest. From Mount Morris in August 1732, she writes, "Since I came here, I have been to Canterbury races, at which there was not much diversion. Only one horse ran for the King's Plate. We had an assembly for 3 nights. The rooms are so small and low that they were exceedingly hot." From this date one perceives that young ladies were allowed to appear in public early. Elizabeth was then not quite 12 years old. In October 1733, she paid, in company of her parents, her first visit to Tunbridge Wells, ever afterwards such a favourite resort of hers. She says, "It is so pleasant a place, I don't wonder the physicians prescribe it as a cure for the spleen. A great part of the company, especially of the gentlemen, are vapoured. When the wind is not in the east, they are very good company, but they are as afraid of an easterly wind as if it would bring caterpillars upon our land, as it did upon the land of Egypt. I am very sorry I could not get you any verses at Tunbridge, of which at the latter part of the season, when the garrets grow cheap, that the poets come down, there is commonly great plenty." Further on she says, "I thank your ladyship for the verses, and I wish I had any to send you in return for them. But my poet is turned lawyer and has forsook the muses for Coke upon Littleton." This alludes to her brother Tom, who was then studying law. The collecting of verses on every sort of circumstance seems to have been fashionable then, as photograph, autograph, or stamp collecting, etc., are now. In the next letter of November 1733, she alludes to Dr. Conyers Middleton, who, as stated before, had married Mrs. Drake, Elizabeth's grandmother, and who was now a widower. "I suppose you have heard Dr. Middleton has brought his cousin place, to keep his house. He very gravely sent us word that his cousin had come to spend the winter with him, and it was not impossible they might agree for a longer time. So I fancy he has brought her with him to see if she likes to play at quadrille, and sup on sack posset with the grave doctors, whose company of one of her gay temper must be delightful. I suspected his designs when he made so many complaints in London, that it was so very difficult to find a maid who understood making jellies and sack posset, which he and a certain doctor used to have for their suppers. He lost one lady because she was deaf to him, but I believe that fortune, to make amends to him, has blinded this. For though I don't doubt he always takes care to show her the side of his face which Mr. Dole says is younger by 10 years than the other, yet that is rather too old to be a match for 25, which I believe is the age of Mrs. Place." The next letter she says, "I have not heard from Dr. Middleton a great while. I suppose his thoughts are taken up with business and his pretty cousin in the West. I don't know whether she has made a complete conquest of his heart." In May 1733, Dr. Middleton now owns his marriage. I wish he finds the felicity of it answers his resigning £100 a year. I'm glad for the sake of any other family he has not got another rich widow. If he had, it would have been her turn to resign. This alludes to the fact that on the learned doctor's remarriage he had to resign his fellowship. Mr. Robinson, Elizabeth's father, was not fond of the country, where his wife's fine estate and his 9 children condemned him to reside the greater part of the year. And when we consider how young a man he was, then only 31, and his great love of witty society, one cannot be surprised at his having attacks of the hip or vapours, as the terms for ennui were then. Elizabeth writes to Lady Margaret from Mount Morris, "Though I am tired of the country, to my great satisfaction I am not so much so as my papa. He is a little vapoured, and last night, after 2 hours' silence, he broke out with a great exclamation against the country, and concluded in saying that living in the country was sleeping with one's eyes open. If he sleeps all day, I am sure he dreams much of London. What makes this place more dull is my brothers are none of them here. 2 of them were away about a fortnight ago, and ever since my papa has ordered me to put a double quantity of saffron in his tea." February 11th, 1734, she writes, "Dr. Middleton sent us word my papa's acquaintance wonder he has not the spleen, but they would cease their surprise if they knew he was so much troubled with it, that his physicians cannot prescribe him any cordial strong enough to keep up his spirits. We think London would do it effectually, and I believe he will have recourse to it." On July 11th, 1734, Lady Margaret Cavendish Harley married William, 2nd Duke of Portland. There are no letters of Elizabeth's in my possession on the occasion of her friend's marriage. They recommence October 20th in the same year. Henceforward, all the Duchess's letters were franked by the Duke, and many of Elizabeth's, often unfortunately undated. At this period, ladies prevailed on such of their friends as were either peers or members of Parliament to sign sheets of letter paper with their names at the back, often of folio size, which they used free of cost as they wanted them wrapping their letters in their outer sheets and sealing them. As a single letter from London to Edinburgh cost 1 shilling 1.5 pence, if double, 2 shillings 3 pence, and treble, 3 shillings 4.5 pence, the smallest enclosure being treated as an additional sheet. To send letters unfranked was a costly luxury. The practice of forging people's names led to such intolerable abuse of franking that an act was passed in 1764, making it compulsory for the whole address to be written by the person franking the letter. In October the same year, Elizabeth replies to a letter from the Duchess chiding her for not writing. October 3rd, 1734. I am surprised that my answer to your Grace's letter has never reached your hands. I sent it immediately to Canterbury by the servant of a gentleman who dined here. I suppose you forgot to put it in the post. I am reconciled to the carelessness of the fellow, since it has procured for me so particular a mark of your concern. If my letter was sensible, what would be the mortification, that instead of having the honour to kiss your Grace's hands, it must lie confined in the footman's pocket with greasy gloves, rotten apples, a pack of dirty cards, and the only companion of its sort, a tender epistle from his sweetheart, true till death. Perhaps by its situation subject to be kicked by his master every morning, till at last, by ill usage and rude company, worn too thin for any other use, it may make its exit in lighting a tobacco pipe. I believe the fellow who lost my letter knew very well how ready I should be to supply it with another. I am, madam, your Grace's most obedient servant, Elizabeth Robinson. The Duchess's favourite name for Elizabeth was Fidget, a name adopted by all the Bulstrode circle. This was due to her vivacity of mind and body. She was never really a strong person, but her nervous energy enabled her frail body to perform feats that a more than lethargic person could not have accomplished. "Why should a table that stands still require so many legs when I can fidget on two?" she would exclaim. The Duchess returns an answer on October 25th, portions of which I copy. "Dear Fidget, I assure you I am very angry at the fellows not taking care of your letter, for they always give me infinite pleasure, and I esteem it at a great loss. I am very sensible of the friendship you have for me, and hope you never shall find any reason to the contrary. You have painted extremely well, for the fate of your letter was not according to its deserts. Pray do you hear anything of Dr. Middleton and his fine wife? I had a letter not long ago wherein it was said she made the doctor very sensible. She had a tongue, and a very sharp one too, with the addition of a clear and distinct voice. If you have any poetry, send it to me. You know it will be acceptable to her who is, dear Fidget's very humble servant and admirer, Madam Cavendish Portland." In Elizabeth's next letter, November 3rd, 1734, she regrets that her father, having recovered his spirits, had given up going to Bath as projected, and said, "One common objection to the country, one sees no faces but those of one's own family. But my papa thinks he has found a remedy for that by teaching me to draw. But then he husbands these faces in so cruel a manner that he brings me sometimes a nose, sometimes an eye at a time. But on the king's birthday, as it was a festival, he brought me out a whole face with its mouth wide open. Your Grace desired me to send you some verses. I have not heard so much as a rhyme lately, and I believe the muses have all got argues in this country. But I have enclosed to you the following summons, which we sent an old bachelor, who is very much a humble servant, and would die but not dance for us. But being once in great necessity for partners, we thought him better than an elbow chair, and compelled him to come to the summons, which pleased me extremely, as I believe it was the first time he ever found the power of the fair sex. I am so far from Cambridge, and have no friend charitable enough to send me any scandal. I have heard nothing of either of the doctors, but as to my dear grandmother, I have heard she was as famous as a free speaker as he is for a free thinker." Summons, Kent to J.B. Esquire. Whereas complaint has been made to us commissioners of Her Majesty's balls, hops assemblies, etc., for the county aforesaid, several able and expert men, brought up and instructed in the art or mystery of dancing, have and daily do refuse, though often thereunto requested, to be detained and exercised in the aforesaid art or mystery, to the occasion of great scarcity of good dancers in these parts, and contrary to the laws of gallantry and good manners, in that case made and provided. And whereas we are likewise credibly informed that you, J.B. Esquire, though educated in the said art by that celebrated master, Lally Senior, are one of the most notorious offenders in this point. These are therefore in the name of the fair sex to require you, the said J.B. Esquire, personally, to be and appear before us at our meeting this day at the sign of the Golden Ball in the parish of Horton, in the county aforesaid, between the hours of 12 and 1 in the forenoon, to answer such matter as shall be objected against you, concerning the aforesaid refusal and contempt of our jurisdiction and authority, and to bring with you your dancing shoes, laced waistcoat, and white gloves, and hereby fail not under peril of our frowns, and being henceforth deemed and accounted an old bachelor. Given under our hands and seals this 8th day of October, 1734, to which we all set our hands. The Golden Ball was the ball of the weathercock on the lantern cupola of the house at Mount Morris. In the next letter, November 20th, she says, "Out of my filial piety, I would persuade my papa to set out for London. I have been preaching to him all this day that when Saul had the spleen, David's music did him a great deal of good, and that I am satisfied Farinelli would do him as much service. He goes frequently shooting or coursing, and fancies that will prevent its return. And to answer me with the scripture says, Nimrod the mighty hunter never had the hip. Dr. Middleton designated to bring his dearie to London. But if she is so gay, it may be prudent to keep her at Cambridge. If it should enter her head that the doctor is no greater than another, what a mortification it would be to my good grandpapa. If he knows himself and her, I think he would agree with Arnulf in Le Cul de Femme. Mr. Robinson, who drew and painted in a style worthy of a professional artist, was anxious Elizabeth should become proficient in the same art. But she writes to the Duchess, If you design to make any proficiency in that art, I would advise you not to draw old men's heads. It was the rueful head countenance of Socrates or Seneca that first put me out of conceit of it. Had my papa given me the blooming faces of Adonis or Narcissus, I may have been a more apt scholar. And when I told him I found these great beards difficult to draw, he gave me St. John's head in a charger, just to avoid the speculation of dismal faces, which by my art I dismalized 10 times more than they were before. I threw away my pencil. And I think I'm going to leave it there for today. As always, if you'd like to pick up where we're leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.